Good afternoon, students, and today we're going to do punctuation, and this video is going to be about how to properly use semicolons as well as other punctuation things to learn. So if you have no questions, I will now share my screen. So the semicolon. The semicolon is used to connect major sentence elements of equal grammatical rank. Use a semicolon between closely related independent clauses, not joined with a coordinating conjunction. When two independent clauses appear in one sentence, they are usually linked with a comma and a coordinating conjunction, and, but, or, nor, for, so, yet. The coordinating conjunction signals the relationship between the clauses. If the clauses are closely related and the relation is clear without a conjunction, they may be linked with a semicolon instead. In film, a low-angle shot makes the subject look powerful, semicolon. A high-angle shot does just the opposite. A semicolon must be used whenever a coordinating conjunction has been omitted between independent clauses. To merely use a comma creates a type of run-on sentence known as a comma splice. In 1800, a traveler needed 6 weeks to get from New York City to Chicago, semicolon. In 1860, the trip by railroad took only 2 days. Use a semicolon between independent clauses linked with a transitional expression. Transitional expressions include conjunctive adverbs and transitional phrases. Conjunctive adverbs: accordingly, also, anyway, besides, certainly, consequently, conversely, finally, furthermore, hence, however, incidentally, indeed, instead, likewise, meanwhile, moreover, nevertheless, next, nonetheless, now, otherwise, similarly, specifically, still, subsequently, then, therefore, thus. Transitional phrases: after all, as a matter of fact, as a result, at any rate, at the same time, even so. For example, for instance, in addition, in conclusion, in fact, in other words, in the first place, on the contrary, on the other hand. When a transitional expression appears between independent clauses, it is preceded by a semicolon and usually followed by a comma. Many corals grow very gradually, semicolon. In fact, comma, the creation of a coral reef can take centuries. When a transitional expression appears in the middle or at the end of the second independent clause, the semicolon goes between the clauses. Biologists have observed laughter in primates other than humans, semicolon. Chimpanzees, however, sound more like they are panting than laughing. Transitional phrases should not be confused with coordinating conjunctions and, but, for, nor, so, yet, which are preceded by a comma when they link independent clauses. Use a semicolon between items in a series containing internal punctuation. Classic science fiction sagas are Star Trek with Mr. Spock, semicolon. Battlestar Galactica, comma, with the Cylons, semicolon. And Star Wars with Hans Solo, Luke Skywalker, and Darth Vader. Without the semicolons, the reader would have to sort out the major groupings, distinguishing between important and less important pauses according to the logic of the sentence. By inserting semicolons at the major breaks, the writer does this work for the reader. Avoid common misuses of the semicolon. Do not use a semicolon in the following situations: between a subordinate clause and the rest of the sentence. Although children's literature was added to the National Book Awards in 1969, it has its own award, the Newbery Medal, since 1992. So whenever a dependent clause starts a sentence, always use a comma, not a semicolon. The scientists were fascinated by the Agrianita aquata, a spider that lives underwater. So don't use a semicolon when you have items in a series and also when you have an appositive. You're supposed to have 2 commas, one before the appositive and one after the appositive, not a semicolon. And then to introduce a list, some of my favorite celebrities have been animal rights advocates. So when you have a list like that, you want to have a colon, not a semicolon, because a semicolon stands for and in between closely related sentences, whereas a colon is used to set off a list. Do not use a semicolon when you have fanboys. When you have fanboys, you want to put a comma before the fanboys. So 5 of the applicants had worked with spreadsheets, comma, but only one was familiar with database management. Okay, and then next one, colon. So when we use a semicolon, like I said, a semicolon separates closely related sentences. A colon, however, is used to set off a list. The colon is used primarily to call attention to the words that follow. In addition, the colon has some conventional uses. Use a colon after an independent clause to direct attention to a list, an appositive, a quotation, or a summary or an explanation. A list. The daily routine should include at least the following. Then you have your colon. 20 knee bends, 50 sit-ups, and 5 minutes of running in place. And a positive. My roommate is guilty of 2 of the 7 deadly sins. Then you have, that's kind of like a list. Gluttony and sloth. A quotation. Consider the words of Benjamin Franklin. And then you would have so whenever you want to set something off like a list or a quotation or a positive, then we use a colon. Colons are used to call attention to something. A summary or an explanation. Faith is like love, colon. It cannot be fixed. The novel is clearly autobiographical, colon. The author even gives his own name to the main character. Use a colon according to convention. Salutation in a letter. Dear Sir or Madame. Hours and minutes. 5:30. Proportions. The ratio of women to men was 2-1. Title and subtitle. The Glory of Hera, colon. Greek mythology and the Greek family. Bibliographic entries. Boston, Bedford, 2014. Chapter and verse in sacred text. Luke 2:14, Quran 67:3. Avoid common misuses of the colon. A colon must be preceded by a full independent clause. Therefore, avoid using it in the following situations: between a verb and its object or complement. Some important vitamins found in vegetables are, and this is not where you would, this is a very common mistake, by the way. So you would say, are the following. Then it's correct. When you say some important, whatever it is, and you would say are, and always write the following, that's okay. But if you just stick in are, then you don't use the colon because it's not a complete sentence. So do not use a colon between a preposition and its object. The hearts of 2 pumps, each consists of the following. So always put in the following. Consists of the following, and then it would be correct. And the NCAA regulates college athletic teams, including the following. So you can avoid all of these mistakes by just writing the following, and then you would have a correct colon. Apostrophe. Use an apostrophe to indicate that a noun is possessive. Possessive nouns usually include ownership, as in Tina's hat, lawyer's desk. Frequently, however, ownership is only loosely implied. The tree's roots, a day's work. If you are not sure whether a noun is possessive, try turning it into an of phrase. The roots of the tree, the work of a day. Pronouns also have other possessive formats. So when to add apostrophe s. If the noun does not end in s, add apostrophe s. Luck often propels a rock musician's career. The Children's Defense Fund is a nonprofit organization that supports programs for poor and minority children. If the noun is singular and ends in s or an s sound, then add s' to indicate possession. Lois's sister spent last year in India. Her article presents an overview of Marx's teachings. To avoid potentially awkward pronunciation, some writers use only the apostrophe with a singular noun ending in s. So when to add an apostrophe. If the noun is plural and ends in s, add only an apostrophe. Both diplomats' briefcases were searched by guards. Joint possession. Use s or s apostrophe with the last noun only to show individual possession. Make all nouns possessive. Have you seen Joyce and George's new camps? John's and Maria's expectations of marriage couldn't have been more different. And so what you do here is then Joyce and Greg, if you just use one apostrophe s, it's like they're a couple. And then if you put an apostrophe s after each one, then that means they're not a couple. So Joyce and Greg jointly own one camper, so it's like they're a couple. John and Marie individually have different expectations. So if it's individual, you do an apostrophe s after each name. If you say George and John's house is red, that means that both John and George, or Joan and George, or John, whomever, all own that house, or that there's some kind of couple. If a noun is compound, use apostrophe s or s apostrophe with the last element. My father-in-law's memoir about his childhood in Sri Lanka was published in October. Use an apostrophe and s to indicate that an indefinite pronoun is possessive. Someone's raincoat has been left behind. Indefinite pronoun refers to no specific person or thing. Everyone, someone, no one, something. And so here you say someone's. Use an apostrophe to mark omissions in contractions and numbers. In a contraction, the apostrophe takes the place of one or more missing letters. It's stands for it is. It's a shame that Frank can't go on the tour. The apostrophe is also used to mark the omission of the first two digits of a year, the class of '08 or the 60s generation. Do not use an apostrophe in certain situations. An apostrophe is not used to make things plural. So if you say books or I have many books, you don't need an apostrophe after books. So don't use apostrophe after plural nouns or plural letters or plural numbers. Do not use an apostrophe in the plural of numbers. Oksana skated nearly perfect figure eights, so no apostrophes. The 1920s are known as the Jazz Age. So because 1920s is plural, more than 1 year, then that means no apostrophes. Plural of letters. So you do not italicize academic grades. 2 large P's were painted on the door. He received 2 D's for the first time in his life. Exceptions. To avoid misreading, use an apostrophe to form the plural of lowercase letters and the capital A and I. Beginning readers often confuse B's and D's. Students with high A's earn high honors. Plural of abbreviations. Do not use apostrophes to make an abbreviation plural. Harriet has DVDs on her desk. Marco earned his 2 PhDs before his 30th birthday. Generally omit the apostrophe to form the plural of words. We've heard enough maybes. Words mentioned words mentioned as words may also appear in quotation marks. When you choose this option, use the apostrophe. We've heard enough maybes. So if the word is between apostrophes, you can use a apostrophe S. But if there are no quotation, a word that appears between quotation marks, you can use an apostrophe S. But if there are no quotation marks, then it's just a regular plural noun. You do not have to use an apostrophe. Quotation marks. Writers use quotation marks to enclose direct quotations of another person's spoken words or written words. You will also find these other uses for quotation marks. So you put a quotation marks for quotation within quotations for titles of short works, for words used as words, with other marks of punctuation, with brackets, and so on. Use quotation marks to enclose direct quotations. Direct quotations of a person's speech, whether spoken or written, must be in quotation marks. Twitter, according to social media researcher Jamison Brown, is the best social media for brand to customer engagement. Use quotation marks in dialogue. Begin a new paragraph to mark a change in speaker. So, Mom, his name is Willie, not William. 1,000 times I've told you, it's Willie. So here you have to have a beginning quotation mark and an ending quotation mark. You have to have a beginning quotation mark and an ending quotation mark. Yes, it does, ma'am. My mother named me Willie K. Mason. So here you have the beginning quotation mark and an ending quotation mark. Do not use quotation marks around indirect quotations. An indirect quotation reports someone else's ideas without using that person's exact words. In academic writing, indirect quotation is called paraphrase or summary. Social media researcher Jamison Brown claims that Twitter is the best social media tool for companies that want to reach their consumers. Exception: long quotations. Long quotations of prose or poetry are generally set off from the text by indenting. Quotation marks are not used because the indented format tells readers that the quotation is taken word for word from the source. After making an exhaustive study of the historical record, James Horan evaluates Billy the Kid like this. The portrait that emerges of Billy the Kid from thousands of pages of affidavits, reports, trial transcripts, and his letters is neither the mythical Robin Hood nor the stereotypical moron and pathological killer. Rather, Billy appears as a disturbed, lonely young man, honest, loyal to his friends, dedicated to his beliefs, and betrayed by our institutions and the corrupt, ambitious, and compromising politicians of his time. Use single quotation marks to enclose a quotation within a quotation. Megan Marshall notes that Elizabeth Peabody's school focused on not merely teaching. So here you have a single quotation mark when you have a quotation inside a quotation. Teaching but educating children morally and spiritually as well as intellectually from the first. Use quotation marks around the titles of short works. So here, Sunny Blues, you have a beginning quotation mark and an ending quotation mark. Quotation marks may be used to set off words used as words. Oh yeah, and also titles of long works such as books, plays, television, radio programs, films, magazines, and newspapers are also put in italics. So here, short works. So you put it in a quotation mark or you put it in, if it's a long title, then you put it in italics. If it's a short title, you put it in quotation marks. That's what they're trying to say. Quotation marks may be used to set off words used as words. Although words used as words are ordinarily italicized, quotation marks are also acceptable. Be consistent throughout your paper. Use punctuation with quotation marks according to convention. So this section tells you about MLA, and because it does both, I'm going to do it according to APA, since that's what we're doing in both my schools. Although some schools use MLA for humanities and then only use APA for social sciences and business, other schools use APA for everything, because most of their students are not humanities students. Most of their students are majoring in social sciences and business, and that's why they use only APA. So what I'm going to do is just go over all of this from an APA standpoint. So place periods and commas inside quotation marks. I'm here as part of my service learning project. I told the classroom teacher, I'm hoping to become a reading specialist. So normally you put the period inside the quotation marks. However, if you're going to do a in-text citation, okay, and then you put in the name, and then of course in APA we also put in a date, and then we put the period after, okay, after everything. So after you put in your in-text citation, after you put in the parentheses, then you put the period. Okay, so since we're focusing on punctuation, then here we put in the period. This is done in this one is done in MLA, but nevertheless, here you put the period at the very end in both APA and MLA. Put colons and semicolons outside quotation marks. Harold wrote, I regret that I am unable to attend the fundraiser for AIDS research, quotation mark, semicolon. His letter, however, came with a donation. And so here the semicolon, so you put the semicolon after the quotation mark. Question marks and exclamation points. Put question marks and exclamation points inside quotation marks. So Dr. Abrams' first question was, what are your goals? Question mark. Unless they apply, and then you put question marks and exclamation points inside the quotation marks, except or unless they apply to the whole sentence. So if your whole sentence is a question, then you can put the question mark outside of the quotation marks. That's the difference. And then what's important to remember for this is to put the period last, after the quotation mark. That's where you put the period. That's a very common mistake. Introducing quoted material. After a word group introducing a quotation, choose a colon, comma, or no punctuation at all, whichever is appropriate in context. If a quotation is formally introduced, a colon is appropriate. A formal introduction is a full independent clause, not just an expression such as he said or she remarked. Thomas Friedman provides a challenging yet optimistic view of the future. Here you have a formal introduction, then you put in the colon. Then you have your whatever it is. So this is this is also known as a signal phrase. And so you would put in the formal introduction to signal to the reader that you're about to start an in-text citation. So this is done in MLA because it's missing. I can tell because it's missing the date. If it had a date, that would be APA. But still, the punctuation for MLA and APA are the same. You still have to put in the colon, and then you have your in-text citation. And so you would use expressions such as he writes. If a quotation is introduced with an expression such as he writes or she remarked, or if it's followed by such an so every time you say John says, John remarked, and remember that in APA you always use in the past tense. So in the past, this is all done with MLA, I could just tell. So that's why it's in present tense. But if you're going to be using APA, your verb should always be in the past tense. So you would say, with regard to air travel, Stephen Ambrose, then you have 2023, noted, with a D, because that's APA, Jefferson was a full century ahead of the curve, and then page 53. So that's how you would do it with APA. And so, beginning of a sentence. If a quotation appears at the beginning of a sentence, use a comma after it, unless the quotation ends with a question mark or an exclamation point. I've always thought of myself as a reporter, so that the comma goes inside the quotation marks. American poet Gwendolyn Brooks once stated, "What is it?" she asked. So always you put the comma after she asked, bracing herself. If a quoted sentence is interrupted by explanatory words, use commas to set off the explanatory words. If two successive quoted sentences from the same source are interrupted by explanatory words, use a comma before the explanatory words and a period after them. Everyone agrees. Journalists must tell the truth. So here you have a beginning quotation mark and an ending quotation mark to tell that this is what Bill Enkovich and Tom Rosenthal wrote. Then after that you put a period, and then you have, yet people are befuddled about what the truth means. So that's how you would use quotation marks. End punctuation. So we use a period at the end of a sentence. Okay, so always use a period. If you don't use a period at the end of your sentence, you end up with a run-on sentence. Always use a period for abbreviations. So Mr., Miss, abbreviations always have a period. And then current usage is there are no periods in these particular abbreviations. Always use a question mark after a question. Use an exclamation point when you get excited about something. Oh my! Wow, what a beautiful dress you have on. So when you're surprised and have some kind of emotion, that's when we use an exclamation point. The dash. We use a dash or a hyphen when you want to emphasize something at the end of a sentence. When typing, use two hyphens to form a dash. Do not put spaces before or after the dash. Use a dash to set off material that deserves emphasis. Everything that went wrong, and then dash. From the peeping Tom at her window last night to my head-on collision today, and then dash, we blamed on our mood. Use a dash to set off appositives that contain commas. In my hometown, people's basic needs, and then dash. Food, clothing, and shelter, dash, are less costly than in a big city like Los Angeles. Well, that's true. Everything in Los Angeles is so expensive. Parentheses. Use parentheses to include supplemental material, minor discretions, and afterthoughts. In other words, if that information is not essential to your sentence, for the sentence to make sense, then you use parentheses. Nurses record patients' vital signs, and then you have parentheses. To what vital signs? What are vital signs? So you put in supplemental information like temperature, pulse, and blood pressure several times a day. Use parentheses to enclose letters or numbers so that you could differentiate them from the rest of the sentence. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Brackets. Use brackets to enclose any words or phrases that you have inserted inside in an otherwise word-for-word quotation. Audubon reports that if there are not enough young to balance deaths, the end of the species California condor, so here you have the brackets because the brackets are inside the quotation mark, is inevitable. The sentence quoted from the Audubon article did not contain the words California condor, since the context of the full article made clear what species was meant. So the writer needed to add the name in brackets. And then you put sick in brackets to indicate that an error in a quoted sentence appears in the original source. the ellipsis. The ellipsis consists of 3 spaced periods. Use an ellipsis to mark that you have deleted words from an otherwise. Okay, so let's say you have a really long direct quote and you don't want to say every single word. So you would say ... That indicates that you skipped some of the words from the original source. So that tells the reader that you didn't put in the whole thing. You skipped part of it and just got to the nitty-gritty that you needed for your paper. So if you delete a sentence or more in the middle of a sentence, use a period before the three dots. Do not use the 3 dots, the ellipsis, at the beginning or the end of a quote. Oh, that's true. Yeah, you don't, otherwise it's going to look really strange. You usually use the ellipsis, that is the 3 dots, in the middle of a sentence. The slash. Use the slash to separate 2 or 3 lines of poetry that have been run into your text. Add a space both before and after the slash. In the opening lines of Jordan, George Herbert pokes gentle fun at popular poems of his time. Who says that fiction only and false hair becomes a verse? Is there, in truth, no beauty? 4 or more lines poetry should be handled as an indented quotation. You don't have to, if you're just going to study social sciences and business, you don't have to worry about slash if you're not going to be writing quotations. Mechanics. So that's basically your chapter on punctuation marks. And in my next video, I'm going to go over mechanics, which is abbreviations, numbers, italics, spelling, the hyphen, and capitalization. So that's going to be the next thing. So this is just a chapter on punctuation. So if you have any questions, see, I will stop this. If you have any questions, feel free to email me anytime.